Hey, how's it going everyone? Sleep Little Monkey here, back with another build guide, and this one's for Blair using Flame Grilled Special, which is this really cool module that turns Blair into this kind of hybrid melee skill power Descendant that does this crazy amount of damage. It also has insane survivability, thanks to his second ability healing not only his HP, but also his MP every time he defeats an enemy. Now, if you guys don't know what Flame Grilled Special does, let me go ahead and throw it up on screen there. Go ahead and pause and read if you need to. But this is also a really good module, it turns out, for running bounties, where I've gotten fire bounties done in 1 minute 48 seconds, which is just insanely fast. I'm certain a better player could get it even faster than that. But that's enough of me yapping. Let's go and get you guys into this build, guys, so you can get out there with Blair. And as always, we gotta start with our mod section, where we'll go ahead and break down every module and go over how they fit into the overall build. Now let's begin with our cooldown mods, starting with Nimble Fingers. Now the reason we're not running Nimble Fingers here is because this is our basic cooldown module, has no downside, and gives us a sizable chunk of cooldown, so we can run it for free here. And then next we have Shield Consumption. And Shield Consumption gives us the largest amount of cooldown possible out of any non-Ancestor module, so it's a pretty sizable chunk of cooldown, with the only downside being minus max shield. But we're fine with that on Blair, because Blair's most efficient survivability stat turns out to be his HP. And this is because his second ability has a cool effect that anytime an enemy is defeated, while it's under the effect of burn, Blair gets healed for 8% of his max HP. So it just makes max HP much better than max shield. Thus, we're fine with getting rid of max shield here. Now, why do we actually want so much cooldown? And in fact, for this build, why are we going to hit max cooldown rate is 75%. Well, there's really two big reasons for this. The first, and the largest reason, has to deal with your third ability. So as I'm sure most people realize with Flame Grilled Special, Blair becomes a melee-based Descendant. Well, it's more of a hybrid melee-based Descendant, since most of his damage comes through his skill power, and that's thanks to his third ability. See, his third ability has a cool effect of every time you hit an enemy with your third ability, you gain this buff that comes in the form of stacks. And it can go up to 30 stacks with the more enemies your ability hits, the more stacks you get. And every time you swing your sword, and that sword attack is a crit, it procs one of those buffs. Now one of those buffs gets consumed, and in exchange, it pops a large burst of explosive skill power based damage. In fact, this is where most Blair's damage comes from, is this explosion. In fact, it's insanely high damage. So, we really want to be able to use your third ability a lot to keep this stack count up. Since we're consuming it so much with every melee swing, we want to be able to spam our third as much as possible so we can keep refreshing our buff there. And the second reason we want so much cooldown here is because of Blair's passive, which has to deal with flame wall count on the ground. See, for every flame wall up to 6, Blair gets additive skill critical hit rate. In fact, it's 6 per flame well, and since we can have a max of 6, that means he gets an additive 36% skill critical hit rate on top of his base 20%, meaning we get 56% skill critical hit rate, which is really huge because that means we don't have to run as much skill critical hit rate in the build to hit max, allowing for more damage in a lot of locations in the build. Now, the reason we want cooldown for this is it help with that flame wall generation, which comes from your first ability and your fourth ability, so that we can spam out as much of those as possible to get that 100% skill critical hit rate, maximizing our damage. And this will also help with us being able to set up flame wells in new areas, since often you'll have to go from one zone to the next. You won't have to wait on cooldowns when you get to the next area to reestablish your flame walls. You'll just be able to instantly set them up because all of your abilities will already be off cooldown. And since we're already discussing the skill critical hit rate in the build, let's go ahead and move on to our crit modules we'll be running, with the first one being skill concentration here. Now running this one because this is just your basic skill crit damage module that has no downside and gives us a lot of skill crit damage, which we want because we want to maximize our damage. And then our next two modules we're running for the same reason, and that's front lines and emergency measures. These also give us a nice chunk of skill crit damage to increase our damage, and it also gives us skill critical hit rate. And the nice thing is, because Blair gets that 56% base skill critical hit rate, it turns out we only need the crit rate from these two modules to be able to hit 100% skill critical hit rate when you have all your flame wells active, which once again, thanks to the cooldown we're running, we're able to do really quickly. And the reason we're running so much crit is once again, thanks to that passive from Blair, and just to maximize our overall damage. And of course, on top of crit, we also gotta increase our damage through skill power mods. And the one we're gonna run here is power increase. But there is an interesting discussion here about power increase. So, depending on your Ancestor module, it actually can be more efficient to instead run Fire Specialist over power increase. So often enough in these videos, I talk about the first Descendant damage formula, and one of the things I talk about that's most important is to try and balance out your skill power pools. So for people who don't know what power increase does, this one increases your base skill power, and Fire Specialist increases your fire skill power. Now the interesting thing is, even without this module, without our Ancestor module, we actually have fairly balanced skill power pools, with our Reactor giving us 20% fire skill power, and Power Beyond giving us 15% base skill power, which is pretty balanced numbers. So the module you want to run here comes down to what you roll on your Ancestor module. If you roll fire skill power boost, like I did on mine, power increase becomes better because this helps balance out the pools. But if you do not have fire skill power in your Ancestor module, it turns out Fire Specialist becomes better because of two reasons. The first being Fire Specialist just gives more percentage of skill power than power increase, and the other reason is because we're going to be running a Mutant Cell that reduces fire resistance based off our fire skill power. So this is just an interesting balancing act that you need to do in pretty much every build in First Descendant, of trying to balance out these skill power pools. But the basic version of this one is, if you roll fire skill power boost ratio on your Ancestor module, run power increase. If you do not roll fire skill power boost on your Ancestor module, you want to run Fire Specialist. Once again, this is just kind of a weird balancing act in First Descendant that you have to do to maximize damage. And then next up we have our skill effect range modules, which are incredibly important modules, with the first one being skill expansion. Now running this one because it's just your basic skill range effect module with no downside, and it's honestly not that much worse than the next best one, but this one doesn't minus your damage like that one, so we take the basic one instead, since our flame wells and burn have fairly low scalings, and we'd rather not ruin the damage numbers on those. And then we have bio expansion as our next one. Once again, HP is extremely efficient on Blair because of his second ability giving him heals based off his max HP. And we also want that skill effect range, which in fact, a really cool thing is, between these two modules and our component set, which we'll go over later in the build, we're able to pretty much exactly hit the max range expansions we can get for our abilities, which is 250%, and we hit 250.5%. So we only have 0.5% efficiency loss, which is incredible. Now, why do we actually want skill effect range, and why is it so important? Well, it's actually kind of funny because it's pretty much the exact same reasons we really want cooldown. So as I talked about, you need your third ability to hit enemies to get those stacks for your explosive damage on your sword swings. Well, you get more stacks per enemy hit, so we want to expand out the range as much as possible of your third ability, so whenever you use it, you hit the max amount of enemies possible in that area and get the max stacks. Because once again, we want to keep those stacks as much as possible. And the second reason has to deal with flame well generation. So, for your first ability, you increase the number of flame wells you can spawn based off your skill effect range. So for every 50%, you spawn another flame well. And with this, we're able to hit the max flame well generation. So once again, these are the exact same reasons as cooldown, and it just helps maximize our damage a lot here, because once again, it maximizes our third ability, and it maximizes our passive through flame well generation. And then next is our survivability module, and this time we'll be running HP amplification. And this is because, once again, Blair just benefits really well from max HP, since his second ability heals him based off his max HP every time an enemy is defeated while under the effect of burn. And the only thing we're sacrificing here is max shield, which we really don't care about since shields honestly don't scale really well at all on Blair. So this is a really good exchange to do, and we don't really take any downsides here. And then as always, we'll go ahead and move our Ancestor mod to its own section where we'll go ahead and break down every stat you can roll on your Ancestor module, put them into a tier chart that you guys can use to reference, determine if your Ancestor module is good, or if you want to go ahead and re-roll it. Now if you want to jump to that now, there's a link in the description, and a timestamp in the timeline of the video itself. And of course we can't forget about our trigger module. And for this build, we'll be running Power Beyond, and this is for two big reasons. The first reason is of course the 15% base skill power boost ratio, which is just a nice way to increase our damage. And the second reason has to do with Power Beyond's second ability, which is for every fourth cast of a global or ground to dot ability, you create a toe effect, which is really nice for our third ability, because when we generate this toe effect, it'll pull all the enemies into a nice little cluster that we can use our third ability on, and don't forget, for every additional enemy hit with your third ability, you get more stacks. Meaning this is just a really nice way where you can maximize your stack gain for your third ability, which in turn ramps up our damage, since most of your damage will come from proccing these stacks with your melee crit, since this will generate those giant explosions that we talked about earlier. And it's really easy for us to generate this toe effect because our first ability and our fourth ability are ground to dot abilities, which we're already spamming out to generate our flame wells, so this just kind of meshes in perfectly with the playstyle. While we're generating these flame wells, it'll create that toe effect, it'll group up all the enemies, you use your third ability on that giant group of enemies, and then you have max stacks, which means you can do your maximize DPS, since you don't have to worry about running out of stacks as easily as you would if you were to just use this on one or two enemies. This is just a really nice playstyle boost. But people may be wondering, well, why not run Battering Ram instead of Power Beyond? Since your third ability is also a clash ability, meaning it can proc Battering Ram. And Battering Ram is really nice because it can reduce enemies' resistance. Well, this is an interesting thing that I tested a lot in the practice tool of seeing the damage number comparison between Power Beyond and Battering Ram. And it turns out Battering Ram just loses a lot of efficiency because we run 3 methods of shred already in this build, with 2 from being from Mutant Cells and 1 being from our component set. So it turns out when we're already reducing the resistance a lot through percentile shred through those 3 other sources, adding the 4th just turns out not to be as efficient as instead increasing our damage through something like skill power. So Power Beyond ends up being a lot more efficient than Battering Ram, unless you're fighting something with some kind of crazily high fire resistance. But then usually the answer is, why are you bringing a fire character if they have that high fire resistance? But in general, Power Beyond should do much more damage than just running Battering Ram. And that's why we run Power Beyond here. Also, once again, the utility from Power Beyond just synergizes really well with Blair's kit using Flame Grilled Special. And now let's dive into our final module section, our Ancestor Mod section, where we'll go over every stat you can roll in your Ancestor module, break them down and put them into a tier chart. You guys can use a reference if your Ancestor module is good, or if you want to go and re-roll it. And starting with our best tier, which is S tier, we have Dimension Skill Power Boost Ratio. Now, the reason why this one's really good is because all of Blair's skills scale off dimension type. And there's not really many places outside your Ancestor module to typically get type skill power, so this is a good way to greatly ramp up your damage. Then we have Fire Skill Power Boost Ratio. Now, we talked about this a little bit in the mod section, but this is a really great one to roll, because not only does it help your Mutant Cell that we'll go over in a little bit, reduce fire resistance, since that Mutant Cell will scale off of our fire skill power, it also will help kind of balance out our skill power pools to maximize our damage, also allowing us to run power increase. to further increase our damage. And then we have skill critical hit damage. Now, this one's just because Blair's once again a crit Descendant, so it scales really well with him. Also, Blair's passive gives him increased skill critical hit damage against targets that are affected by burn. And then we have A tier. Now, A tier is still really good values that can help you a lot while you're playing Blair. And the first one we have is max HP. Once again, as we talked about before, Blair's second ability scales off his maximum HP, so it's just a really good survivability set. Then we have Dimension Skill Modifier. Now this one's really good because Blair's burn and his flame wells have fairly low scalings, so getting more skill modifier on them helps ramp up their damage a lot. Also, this will increase all of his skills, at least slightly in damage. And then for the middle pack values, we have skill duration up. This will just help your burn last longer, and your flame wells last longer. So it's an okay set to roll, but your flame wells still will last a long time even without this. Then we have skill effect range. We talked about this in the mod section. Pretty much though, because we already hit our max skill scalings for range, the only reason you'd get this is to be able to replace one of those modules for more survivability or some more damage. Then we have skill cooldown. Similar logic to skill effect range. We already hit our max skill cooldowns, so the only reason you'd really want this is to be able to replace one of those cooldown modules in the mod section. And then we have max MP. This one is kind of nice because Blair's second ability also heals your MP, and that's based off your max MP. But you're relatively able to keep up with your skill cost as long as you're defeating enemies, so this isn't that big of a stat, but it's okay to roll. And similarly with skill cost here, which is our next value, this does help manage the cost of your second ability, but once again, if you have a wave to kill, you're already going to be keeping your MP topped off. This isn't that big of a stat. And then we have defense, which is just good survivability, especially since you're going to be in the middle of a whole bunch of enemies with this build. It helps out a lot with staying alive, though, once again, if you are defeating enemies, you're going to be staying alive either way because you'll be constantly healing. And then we have C tier. C tier are the values you just kind of want to avoid, because they don't really help the build if you roll them as a positive, but if you roll them as a negative, they will hurt the build a lot. And our only value this time here is skill critical hit rate. And this is once again because we already hit max skill critical hit rate of 100%, and the two modules that we use, front lines and emergency measures, also double up as ways to increase our damage since it gives us skill critical hit damage. So there's no real reason to remove those modules, since removing them would technically lower our damage. So there's no real point on rolling any skill critical hit rate on your Ancestor module. As a positive and as a negative, you really don't want to roll this as a negative because it would just lower your skill critical hit rate to below 100%, meaning your damage is severely less consistent. And then for D tier. Now D tier, these are values that don't really help the build if you roll them as a positive, and don't really hurt the build if you roll them as a negative. So they're perfect to take as negative values to ramp up your positives on your Ancestor module. Our first two here are singular skill power boost ratio and singular skill modifier. Blair has 0 singular skill scalings on any of his abilities here. These are perfect ones to get rid of. And then we have max shield. As we talked about, we don't really care about max shield because HP is the one stat that we focus on for survivability. So shields are also okay to go. And that's going to go ahead and wrap it up for this Ancestor module tier chart. Hopefully this helped you guys determine if your Ancestor modules are good, or if you want to go ahead and re-roll them. And with all of our module sections wrapped up, let's go ahead and jump into our Arche Tree now. So this one's a bit weird. We're actually going for a 2 Mutant Cell setup, where we want to hit the one in the upper left and the one in the upper right. I will explain why when we get into the Mutant Cells, but first let's go over the nodes we're actually hitting here. So the key nodes that we're hitting here are we are hitting the skill critical hit damage nodes. Now this is to maximize Blair's damage since he's a crit Descendant, but we do not need the skill critical hit rate ones because we already are hitting 100% skill critical hit rate thanks to our crit modules and Blair's passive. And then the other one that's important to point out is we're also grabbing the gold skill cooldown node. Don't forget, we want to maximize our cooldown rate so that we can also maximize our spam to keep up our flame wheel generation and our third ability's stack count. And then outside of that, we're just trying to hit skill power to also maximize our damage. Now, let's go over those mutant cells that we're running in the top right and top left. So in the top left, we're running defense neutralization. Now, this one is pretty important because every time you hit an enemy that's at max HP, you shred their defense and their resistance for every resistance value besides non-attribute. But since Blair's fire, and it does shred 30% fire resistance, this becomes fairly efficient at lowering those enemies' resistance values, especially in something like endgame, where they get fairly high resistance values. And then in the top right, we're running Fire Chain Catalyst. Now this is another way that we're shredding resistance, and these do stack. This one shreds resistance based off your fire skill power boost ratio, and this is something we talked about in the mod section, where you really want to make sure you have a decent amount of fire skill power boost ratio so you get max efficiency out of this. Now, technically to get max efficiency out of this is like some absurdly high fire skill power boost ratio, but as long as you either have it through Fire Specialist or through Ancestor module, we'll get enough efficiency from this to greatly ramp up our damage against those high resistance enemies, which in something like bounties or other endgame modes, they tend to have fairly high tank stats. That's why we want to run these two mutant cells, is because it turns out lowering the resistance values becomes much more efficient than just ramping up something like our skill power to be able to maximize our damage in something like endgame. And for our component set, we're going to be running Firebrand set, which is another cool way we're going to end up reducing enemy resistance values. And this is because of Firebrand's 4-set bonus, which every time you inflict burn on an enemy, you reduce their fire resistance, which all of Blair's damage abilities with Flame Grilled Special inflict a burn. And once again, since enemies in endgame modes like Bounty and Onslaught have fairly high resistance values, a lot of maximizing our damage comes from lowering enemies' resistance values. And this is once again just another cool way we do that. Now for the subsets you're going to want here, you're going to want max HP, max MP, defense, and MP recovery modifier. And this is just for more tank stats and to help with our MP regeneration, since Blair's second ability not only regenerates his HP based off his max HP, but it also regenerates his MP based off his max MP. And once again, this is every time you defeat an enemy inflicted with burn. So this is just another way we keep up our stats to be more self-sufficient. Now for your component cores, you're of course going to want 4 max HP. This is once again, HP is just really effective on Blair. And 4 defense, which just becomes really efficient, since defense will help reduce the damage you're taking. And now time for our Inversion Reinforcement, with our first node being Sturdy Fortress. Now the reason we're running this one is because every time you land a melee hit, you increase your melee attack range, which is really important, because this allows you to be able to hit enemies a lot easier, since you need to be able to land a melee crit to be able to proc the explosion from your third ability, which once again is the majority of our damage. And then we have Deploy Hardened Shell. Every time you take damage, you get damage taken reduction, which is really nice since enemies hit really hard in endgame, and getting percentile damage taken reduction is just really good. And then Combat Adaptation is the same logic. Every time you defeat an enemy, you get incoming damage taken reduction, which once again just helps a lot with survivability, especially since with this mod for Blair, he becomes a melee Descendant, well, a melee hybrid Descendant, and that means he'll be in the middle of a whole bunch of enemies, meaning you'll often take a lot more damage. So taking damage taken reduction becomes really efficient on him. And the reactor we'll be running for this build will be a Fire Dimension Reactor. That's because of course Blair is a Fire Descendant, and all of his abilities are of type Dimension. Now, for your substats, you want Skill Cooldown, is once again to be able to hit that max skill cooldown rate, and skill critical hit damage. This is because Blair has really high skill crit damage stats, and he's a crit Descendant, so this will just overall ramp up your damage a lot. And now time for the weapons we're going to be running in this build. But before we go over them, there are 2 quick notes I want to make. First, because the weapons are not the main focus, and instead Blair is, I won't go in depth over the weapon builds like I did for Blair. Instead, I'll show the weapon builds on the screen, and discuss the general overview of them and why we're running these particular weapons. 2, In the gameplay shown in this build guide, you guys may have seen me swapping to Truly Deadly Arson. That weapon is not necessary for this build, so we will not be going over it. I was merely using it as a mobility weapon, since you can get 2 grapple hook cores on it. But if you wanted a mobility weapon like that one, I'd recommend Peacemaker instead, since that one can get 3 mobility cores on it, or 3 yellow cores. That's just one point I wanted to make, was it's not necessary for this build at all. It's just something I run in some of these builds to help increase my mobility so I can get faster clear times. But let's go over the actual weapons you do need for this build. So the first one here is Deus Ex. You guys may be looking at this build thinking it looks like a mess of a whole bunch of different stats, which is kind of true, but turns out this is the way to min-max this build. So, for Blair to be able to proc his 3rd ability, which is his main damage source, you need to be able to crit with a weapon. So we need a weapon that can have decently high crit, which Deus Ex, our first one here, does have fairly high base crit. In fact, we'll get to about 90-91% crit, which is enough to give us a fairly consistent crit rate. Now, we need that crit rate to be able to proc the explosions, but you guys may also see that we're running additional hit chance here, which has a really cool effect with Blair's 3rd ability stacks. So, if people don't know what additional hit chance does, it basically means every time you hit with a melee, you have a chance to basically get an additional proc of damage. Now, this additional proc of damage actually counts as kind of like a phantom hit from the sword. And these phantom hits apply on hit effects, which Blair's 3rd ability stacks are counted as on hit effects. Meaning each time you get an additional hit chance, as a successful additional hit, it procs another explosion. And the other cool thing about additional hit chance is you can go beyond 100%. And every time you go an additional 100% beyond, you're guaranteed another additional hit chance. Now, we hit, actually, thanks to Deus Ex's cores, about 220% additional hit chance, I believe. Which means with every time you crit, you're actually guaranteed 3 explosions. In fact, because we get an additional 20% beyond that 200%, you have the small chance to actually get 4 explosions, meaning this greatly ramps up our damage per swing. That's why we want additional chance, is to be able to proc more explosions per swing. This is how you guys see in a lot of this gameplay, I just shred the boss in bounties. That's why, it's because we're actually getting triple and sometimes even quadra damage on that boss thanks to additional hit chance. And then the other modules in this one where we're just running additional attack range, that's just so we can more easily hit the boss and other enemies. And then just a lot of utility mods to just kind of help us overall, since once again, Deus Ex's actual damage doesn't matter, we're just using it as more or less a medium to be able to proc Blair's 3rd ability stacks, which is a lot of our damage. And this is why Deus Ex is really good for this build, is because of its innately high critical hit chance, and the fact that it has multiple red cores, meaning we can get a whole bunch of additional hit chance, allowing us to once again maximize our damage with this. And then of course you also want a lot of attack speed with this, so we have to run a lot of attack speed to be able to, swing faster, and have a higher chance of once again getting our crits and increase our overall DPS. And now our second weapon is Hypernova. Now, this one's kind of an interesting weapon, because basically it has almost all the same reasons that we're running this as we did for Deus Ex. It has high crit rate, in fact we get this up to max crit rate, and you can get at least 1 additional hit chance proc, since we get 100% additional attack chance. While that isn't as great as Deus Ex's is getting 2, sometimes 3, Hypernova has a faster attack speed, meaning it's pretty decent in its DPS as well. In fact, if it wasn't for a bug with Hypernova, Hypernova would actually be the recommended sword for this build, since it has its ultimate ability, giving a toe effect, which, as we talked about with our trigger module, having that toe effect and grouping up both enemies, allows us to get more stacks from our 3rd ability, since we're hitting more enemies with our 3rd ability. Now, this bug I will show off in the tricks and tips section because it is a really, really funny bug. But to sum it up, the bug is your ultimate abilities on your swords can actually proc a Blair's third ability stacks. And in theory, it sounds really good because you just throw the toe effect, you apply your third ability to them, and all the stacks just get instantly popped, deleting the wave. But it turns out it doesn't proc Blair's third ability explosive stacks on the target. Instead, it puts them on the center of the map. And I mean the entire level / map. Once again, I'll show this in the practice tool because it's a fairly funny bug. But yeah, basically, you could be at the very start of the map, and it will put them and the explosion will start happening somewhere in the middle of the map, and it will be nowhere near the enemies. So that's why Hypernova's our secondary use weapon, is because the unique ability can just accidentally waste all of your third ability stacks, and then you just lost all your DPS. But if you don't use its unique ability, it's actually a fairly good weapon and a good substitute for Deus Ex here. But Deus Ex is more efficient, in my opinion, because of the additional hit chance. And finally, time for the tips and tricks section, in which I'll show you guys a few things to help you along while you're playing Blair, and a couple bugs to kind of avoid. So the first thing I wanted to explain was the flame wall system, which kind of gets tricky, because I don't think it's very well explained. So, as we were talking about in the mod section, your flame wall count that you spawn increases with skill effect range. So the issue though is, without any enemies, you only spawn one at your feet, because you can only spawn one beneath yourself and one per enemy. So if we go ahead and spawn one enemy here, over here, I'll only actually spawn two. You guys can see, one for each. And this actually works up until the cap of skill effect range. So we can actually spawn, if we spawn 11 enemies here, we will actually spawn 6, because the max skill effect range is 300%, and you spawn 1 for every 50%. Now, technically, I don't know if that is actually a bug, because it does say in that particular section that it goes up to 200%, but I think that may just be referring to the detection range for the enemies that you can actually detect to spawn a flame underneath them. But either way, it doesn't matter, because in this build we usually only run 250%. The only reason I have 300% is because my Ancestor module actually has a little bit of skill effect range on it. But it usually doesn't matter either way, because you get 2 stacks of flame well, and also your fourth ability also spawns flame wells. So it doesn't really matter between the 5 and 6 there. The thing I just wanted to explain was how you can actually spawn these flame wells, since it's important for your skill critical hit rate. Now, the next thing I wanted to explain is we'll go ahead and spawn that in 1. I want to show you guys the additional hit chance I was talking about with the weapons. So this Hypernova right here actually has 0 additional hit chance. So I'll go ahead and get our stacks there. As you guys can see there in the bar, we have 7, since we only hit 1 enemy. So if I hit this enemy, well, I need a crit. There we go. You have to get a sword crit. As you can see, it only consumed 1 stack. But if we swap to, let me refresh the stack count. We're going to swap to Deus Ex, and when we crit Deus Ex, as you guys can see, it consumed 4. As I said, it will go between 3 to 4. I'm actually getting quite lucky here. It keeps consuming 4. There you go. 3 stacks consumed, you guys can see. Now this does increase our consumption rate a lot, but because the DPS is so much higher, thanks to us proccing that multiple times, it's okay to have the increased consumption rate, because you're basically tripling your damage. This will help you shred bosses and a lot of the tankier enemies, since it doesn't matter if you consume all your stacks right away if you're one-shotting the entire wave, or the boss. Now, the next thing I wanted to show you guys is, I talked about this before. So let's go ahead and we'll spawn like 5 enemies. I'm going to show you guys a Hypernova bug. So let's go ahead and get our stacks. We got 15. So this is about center of the map. So if you use Hypernova right here. Oh, there's center of the map. You can see it's exploding all the way over here. Now just remember that location. and we're gonna go do this again, and we're gonna move them slightly. And you can see it doesn't change. It doesn't matter where we go ahead and move them to. We move them all the way over here. It still goes in that point. That's why I'm saying there's a Hypernova bug, and why you shouldn't use the Hypernova's unique ability, because it will just spawn the explosion in the center of the map. This actually happens in dungeons too. I've tried it in dungeons. The explosion was nowhere near anywhere I was actually throwing Hypernova. I couldn't even see the explosion, it was just consuming the stacks. And the issue is when you do that, it procs on each enemy, so you just instantly eat through all your stacks. And this, don't forget, this is a Hypernova without additional chance. So if it had additional chance, it would be consumed in like 1 second. So yeah, that's just like a really funny bug, but one you guys should avoid. And it's just something I wanted to show you guys. Now eventually, if they do fix that bug, Hypernova will become ideal, because you'll just, and in theory, use Hypernova like this, get all your procs, and it should, in theory, it should be in the center of that. But since it doesn't work like that, Hypernova's not that great. The last thing I want to show you guys was when you're running from point to point, you actually, in your passive, if an enemy's on fire, get additional movement speed towards them. So a really cool thing to do is you can just throw your Fourth ability at them while you're running towards them, and this will just give you a nice boost to get to them even faster. It's just like a fun little thing you can do to like speed up your runs. Anyways, that's it for the tips and tricks. Hopefully this will help you guys along while you're playing Blair. And that's going to go and wrap it up for this Blair build guide, which I've been having a lot of fun using. I think they really did nail this kind of hybrid melee skill power Descendant playstyle, which has made Blair a lot of fun play with this module in particular. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments down below, or if you have any questions, also hit me up down below as well. And if you plan to use the build, or you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate it if you could hit that like button. Helps out the video a lot. And if you want to know when new videos are coming out, don't forget that subscribe button and that notification bell. I plan to do a lot of Blair build guides this month, so look forward to that. Also, I do stream most days on Twitch. I'll go and throw up the information on the screen there. And once again, if you guys could hit that like button, I really would appreciate it. It helps the video get out to a lot more people. But that's going to go and wrap it up for this video. Appreciate y'all watching. I'll catch y'all again next time.